And so I do worry that, if we don't use economic warfare wisely, it's only a matter of time before it kind of bridges us into, real shooting wars.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, a contributor to the Bulwark and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, who is the Professor Emeritus of Strategy, Robert E. Osgood Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you on this fine day?
I am enjoying the beautiful weather. I'm also enjoying, now that Passover is over, I can bake bread again. That's a great feeling. One way in which I do not have anxiety when I approach our weekly recording of Shield of the Republic is, will we be able to fill the segment of jackassery of the week from the Trump administration? And I want to throw actually a whole bunch of bouquets at Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth, who really has given us a lot of material to work with. I got on, as I'm sure you did, I get the Department of Defense press releases, which had the following gem. Regular workforce adjustments are a feature of any highly efficient organization. Secretary Hegseth will continue to be proactive with personnel decisions and will work hard to ensure the Department of Defense has the right people in the right positions to execute President Trump's agenda. It then announces the appointment of no fewer than four special advisors. Special advisors are people who don't actually have jobs. Meanwhile, he's lost his chief of staff, deputy secretary's chief of staff, deputy chiefs of staff. I'll let you talk about screaming matches and polygraphs since you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal about that. And then on top of all those things, Secretary Hegseth, who was last seen yelling at reporters standing next to a guy in a bunny suit at the White House Easter egg roll, apparently put an unclassified line into his office so that he could have a computer with Signal on it. And then on top of that, ordered the spending of thousands of dollars for a makeup room that he could use in the Department of Defense. So he not only has, bulging biceps from all the push-ups, but, the mascara or whatever it is he's applying looks just so.
I think it's, looking at Vice President Vance, I think it's mostly eyeliner in this administration, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on the makeup side.
There's nothing wrong with that. Let's be very clear. So, but you're the one who was quoted in the Wall Street Journal about screaming matches and polygraphs and.
Yeah, I mean, to your list of foibles that the Secretary of Defense has demonstrated in the last week. I mean, the other one is that, his escapade on Signalgate not only, apparently exposed classified information about the strikes on the Houthis in the chat with Michael Waltz and other senior officials, but he also had another Signal chat going with his wife, his former attorney, who now has a position, somewhat undefined in the Department of Defense, and his brother, who is the Department of Homeland Security liaison to the Department of Defense, whatever that means, actually, and none of whom had a need to know about any of this. Apparently, according to what Axios has reported, even President Trump said he found his second Signal chat group kind of childish, which must have put the fear of God into Secretary Hegseth. But also, it appears from reporting in the New York Times that his personal phone line number has been readily available to people. So what do you think the odds are that all of this information, was not, available to various intelligence services around the world? The Wall Street Journal did report that that he was screaming at acting chairman Admiral Grady, that he was going to hook him up to a polygraph, accusing him of being responsible for some of the leaks. Apparently, the director of the Joint Staff was also treated to this kind of behavior, a 3-star. And, at an interview with Megyn Kelly, Colin Carroll, one of the defenestrated senior officials who'd been chief of staff to Deputy Secretary Feinberg, said that since Signalgate, the Secretary of Defense has been spending no less than 50% of his time fretting and trying to dig out who the leakers are. And of course, the number of people who might be involved in this is legion, because as the spokesperson of the White House said, the entire Department of Defense is against Secretary Hegseth, which, if true, I don't know that to be true, but if it were true, would be pretty stunning admission.
Yeah, I mean, the serious thing behind all this is your comment in the Journal, which is completely accurate, that this is a guy who's in way, way over his head. I mean, who the two times he tried to run an organization failed. These were nonprofits. And, I've always thought somebody in that position who knows that they're in over their head. I mean, he'll clutch at things, which will be physical fitness standards, the one thing I think he feels he understands. But for the rest, it must be, psychologically, he must be a mess. I mean, there just must be this sort of sense of desperation. And particularly, as we both know, when you're in government and people begin leaking against you, it does feed the paranoia, which unfortunately is kind of a norm in high-level positions. So we feel sorry for him here at Shield of the Republic.
Yeah, as our mutual friend, the late Dr. Henry Kissinger, used to say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you don't have real enemies. So, well, let's move on to our guest. We have a special guest today, and it's a timely subject. Our guest is Edward Fishman, who is the author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, a book which came out recently. Obviously, the topic is almost self-explanatory, but Eddie is a senior research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international public affairs at Columbia University, a university that, as President Trump might say, may be going through some things. He is a distinguished academic pedigree, a BA in history at Yale, which is only fitting since we had one of your former students from Harvard on last week, Eliot, and then an MPhil from Cambridge and an MBA from Stanford. So in addition to his government service, which has managed to incorporate the Departments of Treasury, State, and Defense in various capacities, Eddie is very well positioned to have written this very, I would say, incredibly engaging book on a topic that normally induces, sort of yawns from people. So, Eddie, welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Eric, Eliot, thank you so much for having me on today.
Let me kick this off by kind of betraying my own bias here, which is, since Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense that as long as it was the custom of Europeans to eat, that the United States, because of its rich agricultural production, would always be secure in the world. Americans have thought that their economic power was, a source of strength, but also an alternative to actually kinetic military action. And you certainly highlight how it's become, a very, very important tool over the last 20 years or so, precisely because it's seen as an alternative to military action. So tell us a little bit about how you came to write the book, and maybe lay out a little bit of the argument about the three cases in particular that you use, Iran, Russia, China, to show the power of this instrument of national power.
Sure. Thank you. And I think maybe it would be helpful to start by talking about my motivations for writing the book, because I think that'll help us also get into some of the substance itself. It really goes back to my time in government. I had the good fortune of working on the Iran sanctions in the lead up to the nuclear deal, as well as the Russia sanctions in the wake of the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. And I distinctly remember the discussions we had in the Situation Room in the months following the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the debate over whether or not to arm the Ukrainians with javelins. And the thing that stood out to me about those debates, even though at the time I was sitting at the State Department, is that every agency around the table had a really intense opinion. It wasn't just the Pentagon or the Joint Staff, it was the CIA, it was the State Department, it was the NSC staff, and it was a really fulsome debate. Ultimately, as we all know, President Obama decided not to arm the Ukrainians, which I think was a mistake, but it was a very intense debate. Yet, when we spoke about sanctions and economic warfare, which ultimately was the foremost tool that we were using in that conflict in 2014, 2015, oftentimes the room would just go quiet. And at most, maybe one or two people would weigh in with really informed, passionate opinions. And oftentimes those people would carry the day because, the other agencies, the other people around the table didn't really feel like they had the requisite knowledge to weigh in constructively. And I think that that's because even though there's knowledge within Washington that sanctions are a thing, they're important, they're oftentimes seen as very technocratic. And as you said, they induce boredom to some people. And so we don't really have this depth of knowledge on these tools. And so the debates I would often see would just be somewhat juvenile, honestly. They wouldn't be very well informed. And it would really be one or two people shaping the discussion. And so when I left government, I really had this conviction, this is now going back to 2017, that we were living in an age of economic warfare in which sanctions, export controls, investment restrictions, tariffs were becoming the primary way that great powers were competing with one another, and that this would only continue. And it wouldn't just be the United States waging economic warfare, but other countries, and that we'd soon be dealing with sort of a multipolar economic warfare world where China was waging economic warfare against us, and Europe would have their own weapons, and Japan. And I was concerned, honestly, that we didn't have the type of intellectual capital we needed, or frankly, the government structures to be able to succeed in this kind of an era. And so that's what really motivated me to go over to Columbia and teach my class at SIPA, where I teach a class on economic statecraft, which is now one of a handful of classes. I know SAIS has a similar class, and there are a few other universities that do, but it's still not a particularly common subject to learn when you're going through graduate school studying public policy in the United States. And then really was during the 2022 second bigger invasion of Ukraine, when we saw some really unprecedented sanctions by the West on Russia, that my students came to me and said, Professor, you got to find a way to scale this class, find a way to, spread this message to more people. And so they were really the ones who initially encouraged me to consider writing the book. And really what I was trying to do first and foremost with Chokepoints was to give people a resource where if they want to understand how we got here, how did we go from kind of the win-win globalization of the 1990s to this age of economic warfare, that they could read this single volume and feel like they kind of got it. And that it wouldn't be something that was a textbook, that wouldn't just be interesting to, people who are at a school like SIPA, but that really any American could pick up off the shelf, read it, and feel like they could engage constructively in a national debate on economic warfare.
I think you succeed in that. It's a very readable book. You have these, the contemporary case studies are very, very interesting. One thing I think you do particularly well at the beginning of the book, and I was wondering if you might share it with our listeners, is describing the way in which American leverage of the global financial system really grew by leaps and bounds. I mean, by orders of magnitude that I confess I did not fully understand. I mean, I think, we're all, most people who care about international affairs are aware that, after World War II, the United States has 60% of global GDP. It kind of goes down to about 25% by the time you're in the 70s or 80s, where it's remained. That's a pretty stable percentage. But meanwhile, as you describe it, our leverage over the international financial system is totally transformed. So could you talk us through that?
Sure. And maybe just before answering your question directly, I think it's worth explaining what I mean by choke points, because I think this gets at your question, Eliot. So a choke point in the global economy is one area where a single country has a dominant position and there are very few, if any, substitutes. So oftentimes you think about choke points in the sort of the maritime domain, where you can block a strait and cause economic damage. The economic choke points I'm talking about are really where you can just with the stroke of a pen cut off a key resource to a foreign country and impose really devastating pain. right? And that's existed also for decades in terms of key resources. The early 70s, you had the Arab oil embargo. That was when the Saudis and the Arab states really produced a lion's share of global oil output. The dollar, though, has played this really unique role because it's involved in everything, right? It's not just a financial instrument; it's the key medium of exchange for global trade. And so, being cut off from the dollar today is really probably the single most powerful economic choke point we've seen in modern history. The story of how we got there is kind of interesting because most people will know that the dollar was sort of formally inserted as the global reserve currency at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. So, it had been the global reserve currency in a de jure way, really, since the mid 20th century. But for the sort of first 3 decades of this system, really the system was designed to have stable exchange rates. The dollar is pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and that's because trade is sort of given predominance over finance by the architects of Bretton Woods. Harry Dexter White and Keynes really thought that it was important for exchange rates to be stable. And they thought that the floating exchange rate system that kind of happened in the 1930s had actually worsened and globalized the Great Depression. The thing that's so interesting, and it just goes to show how, history doesn't always play out the way you expect it will, in that it's really when this system of fixed exchange rates against the dollar comes under strain in the 1970s, with the US running big deficits with the Vietnam War, and basically countries, including our close allies, France and Britain, exchanging their dollar or their dollars for gold en masse. And then Richard Nixon unilaterally in August of 1971, removing the dollar gold peg, that is kind of seen at the time as like the end of American economic hegemony. And in retrospect, it kind of is, right? Our share of global trade declines quite a bit in almost a steady fashion from the 1970s to the present. But what happens is when the dollar becomes liberalized and you have a liberalized exchange rate regime and you no longer have these controls around dollars, and you have an explosion of the euro dollar market, which is this offshore dollar lending market that starts in Europe, that is really almost an illicit market, and in a way almost that cryptocurrency started in the US, but then again endorsed by the US government. And then in the mid 1970s, when you get the petrodollar kind of being inserted as this key part of global finance, it's actually a deal struck by Richard Nixon's final Treasury Secretary, Bill Simon, with the Saudi government, where we exchange military assistance and preferential access to Treasury auctions in exchange for Saudi Arabia's commitment to recycle their oil earnings, their petrodollars, into U.S. treasuries. It's that sort of lays the foundation for this hyper financialized global economy. And then, of course, the deregulation of the Carter and Reagan and Clinton administrations, coupled with the end of the Cold War, which brings China and Russia into this system, is really what enables, by the 90s, the dollar to play this unprecedented role. And I think the best statistic is when you go back to this dawn of the sort of dollarized system in the early 70s, foreign exchange trading is very small. There's not a big foreign exchange market. By the end of the Cold War in 1989, it was something like $1 trillion a day in foreign exchange transactions. But today, it's $7 trillion a day, every single day, which is just remarkable. It's by far the biggest financial market of them all. And 90% of foreign exchange transactions include the dollar. And compare that to trade, right? The US is 10% of global trade. So you just see that our role in finance greatly outstrips our role as a trading power.
Is that unnatural in some way?
Yes. I mean, I think yes, in that normally when you think about it historically, finance really exists to facilitate trade, the role that the dollar has come to play is like nothing we've ever seen before, right? And even within these foreign exchange transactions, obviously, most of them are not related to, foreign countries buying goods from the United States, right? That would just be mathematically impossible. And some of them are involved in foreign countries trading with each other. So an example I give in the book is, a Saudi company and an Indian company are trading with each other, even though neither of them are use the dollar as their domestic currency. Their transactions are going to, by necessity, go through the dollar. But then there's this whole other range of activities, which are just investment activities, right? It's, foreign companies that are generating dollars that are then taking their dollars and buying treasuries, buying stocks. If you look at the size of American stock and bond markets, both of them are over 50% of global of the global market share in their respective categories. So we've just become this hyper financialized economy domestically, which I think everyone sees. And we're seeing viscerally now when, our stock market's not performing well and everyone is absolutely angered by it, and companies are worried about laying off people. But, the global economy has been financialized too, and it's really the dollar at the center of everything.
Yeah, this is what, and I think you quote Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, former French finance minister and former French president, and other French diplomats like Hubert Védrine have said it as well. This is the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. as the world's holder of the world's reserve currency. And even though people have, for a decade or so, since 2008-9, have been writing obituaries for the dollar as the reserve currency, it hasn't happened yet. Might happen, but it hasn't, gone away yet. You talk about the role of the dollar. The other thing I think you talk about is, and the weaponization of, as Eliot was saying, our financial advantages. And there's another piece too, which is the export control piece, which allows the U.S. to kind of maintain its technological edge. There was a Cold War side to this when we had the committee on trade with the communist world to try and prevent dual use goods that could be used for military purposes to be traded by our allies to the Soviet Union, to Soviet bloc countries, PRC as well for that matter. But you talk about how, in a world of high tech, these kinds of export controls have also been weaponized, like the use of various U.S. content regulations to prevent high-tech goods from being transferred to Russia, China, Iran. Could you talk about that a little bit too, Eddie?
Sure. Yeah. So going back to choke points, right? These are areas where one country has a really dominant position and there are few substitutes. So we talked about the dollar just has massive share in everything from foreign exchange transactions, stock markets, bond markets, cross-border payments. All of the share for the dollar in these areas greatly outstrips our role in global trade. So I just to reiterate, 10% of global trade, 90% of foreign exchange transactions. As Eliot correctly said, 25% of global GDP. So in all of those areas, the dollar is more important than our weight overall in the global economy or in the international trading system. Another area where the U.S. kind of has disproportionate power is in the high technology, and particular semiconductors that underpin so much of industry today. So if you look at the semiconductor value chain, U.S. companies are actually contributing 40% of the global semiconductor value chain. And it's interesting because, we are used to thinking, oh no, we're dependent on Taiwan for all of our chips, which is true in that Taiwan is fabricating the chips, as is South Korea. But the actual technology going into the chips, the designs from companies like NVIDIA or the tools from companies like Applied Materials, a big percentage of it is coming from the United States. And it's to the point where you really cannot produce the highest end semiconductors without access to US companies. And so really starting during the first Trump administration, the US started weaponizing these chip controls against individual Chinese companies. First, it was ZTE, the second biggest telecommunications equipment maker in China, eventually scaled up to Huawei, which of course is the largest private company in China, is really kind of the company right now at the heart of Xi Jinping's effort to make China the world leader in various technologies. And then during the Biden administration, these chip controls were scaled up even further to cover the entire Chinese economy. And I think one of the themes of my book, Chokepoints, is that, we often tell our history in silos where it's like, here's a history of the US-Iran policy or US-Russia policy. But what we miss is that the way that we've developed economic warfare strategies against one country will then get adopted and influence our strategies against another. And so the foreign direct product rule, which is sort of the equivalent of secondary sanctions for these chip export controls, where we tell a company like TSMC, the big semiconductor foundry in Taiwan, that they can either produce chips for Huawei or buy technology from the US, but they can't do both. We actually take that principle and apply it to Russia after the 2022 Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine, where we try to cut off Russia from all access to semiconductors through a similar mechanism. So it has become a weapon comparable to financial sanctions. What I would say, though, is it's definitely not as powerful as financial sanctions. And I'm happy to get into the reasons if that's interesting.
There are different kinds of economic warfare, and you do have some of the earlier history, but you're understandably much more focused on these recent cases. And I guess one thought that I had going back in history a bit was, I mean, Americans, as Eric pointed out, do have this fondness for economic warfare or belief that it'll work. And I can think of at least two episodes, which you chose not to talk about because, as I said, you're not writing a 73-volume history of economic warfare, which backfires, arguably. One is quite early on in the Republic, the Thomas Jefferson's embargo in 1807 of exports to Britain and France, which does nothing to change the behavior of the European states. It does cause it creates economic problems in the United States and leads to a lot of sectional friction, because particularly the merchants of New England, are furious that their trade is being affected by that. So that's one case. The one that's, I think, more pertinent, and maybe I could, to the extent you feel comfortable, willing to talk about it, is the United States does use economic coercion as a tool of diplomacy in the run-up to the Second World War, except we didn't know that it was the run-up to the Second World War, beginning with imposing an embargo on scrap iron sales to Japan in 1940, which actually bit because it really affected their shipbuilding industry. And then, above all, the 1941 oil embargo. And I think most historians would now agree this is really what set Japan on the path to war with the United States. And whereas we thought this would bring them to heel, actually what it did was provoke them to attack us. And we all know how that turned out. Do you think that there's a similar danger here of having this powerful weapon to hand? And it was, in the case of Japan, it was powerful. I mean, they were going to need an alternative source of oil, which is why they end up taking what's now Indonesia. But one which can really blow up in your face in a big way, particularly if you're up against a country that thinks it has a fighting chance against you in some way.
Great question, Eliot. Look, I think there are two ways I'd like to respond to that. And I think the first is the rise of economic warfare over the last 20 years in U.S. foreign policy, I think in part was inspired by the creation of these choke points, which again, they don't really get formed until the 90s. Because even though you do have a financialized, globalized economy by the 90s, it's really in the 90s that the Chinese and Russians enter it, right? It's only really only exists amongst the advanced industrialized democracies until the 1990s. And so, unless you're imposing sanctions against Germany or something, or against France, it's not going to be as powerful, right? I think that what really happens in the earlier part of the 21st century is that Americans and American politicians fall out of love with the use of military force, right? In the wake of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, really the desire to use the military instrument of power kind of evaporates. And in some ways, we kind of forget in the 1990s, we had a number of, limited military interventions in various countries around the world, right? And it was almost seen as natural for the U.S. to project power in places like the Balkans or Africa or parts of Latin America. We have not done much of that in the last 15, 20 years. And I think a big part of it is the legacy of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the idea that, military power is like something we don't like to use, right? And so in some ways, economic warfare rises to prominence because it's seen as something that's different from military power, and you don't have to deploy troops, and you're not risking, American lives. I think that the concern I have, and it's something I talk about in the latter part of my book, is that, we have come to use these tools in somewhat of a willy-nilly fashion. And we forget that there are many examples in history where economic warfare isn't an alternative to a war, but it's actually something that precipitates war. I would 100% agree with the way that you characterized the oil embargo in the lead up to Pearl Harbor. By the way, I think the same is true even for the first use of economic warfare in recorded history. If you go back to the Megarian Decree in 432 BC, there's, I think, good historical analysis, including my own mentor, Don Kagan, who viewed that as something that potentially did, influence a faction within Sparta to view the Athenians as, untrustworthy, as sort of unhinged, and that, they couldn't be dealt with diplomatically. So I worry that we have kind of policymakers view sanctions, tariffs, export controls on like this spectrum that is like the non-kinetic spectrum, when in reality, like we actually don't know, right? And we could be precipitating military conflict. I think that the second point, and this also ties into the Japanese motivations, you mentioned that some of their conquests in Southeast Asia may have been motivated by trying to seize oil fields, right? Because they couldn't buy oil from the United States anymore, right? By the way, there's also evidence that Hitler was motivated, for some of his conquests through economic means, and trying to acquire, the industrial capacity of Central Europe, for instance, right? I worry that if the United States is deploying economic warfare, not just against a small subset of countries, not just against the Chinas and Russias of the world, but against everyone, right? Against Canada, Mexico, the European Union, Japan, really any country you can think of. I mean, we are kind of, whether we like it or not, going to incentivize something that looks a lot more like autarky. Because if you're a business leader, and you're right now, I talk to business leaders all the time, they say, Eddie, where can I invest safely? Where can I put my supply chain? I say, I don't know, right? I mean, they're maybe you think it's India, but who knows? They're just one dust up with Trump away from getting big tariffs on India or something, So I worry that in a world where we're kind of maybe in a macro way, in a 5, 10, 20-year period, moving towards something that looks more like autarky, what history shows is that when a state doesn't feel confident that it can acquire a market or resources through open trade, the incentive for conquest and imperialism goes up quite a bit. And so when I hear Trump's rhetoric about seizing Greenland for the mineral resources, I mean, I don't know whether or not he's serious about that, but I do think that mentality is tied toward this view of autarky, that we literally cannot feel confident in our ability to access a key resources unless it's like within our legal control, within our borders. And so I do worry that, if we don't use economic warfare wisely, it's only a matter of time before it kind of bridges us into real shooting wars.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The only comment, which is really in agreement, I think one of the reasons why people may have gotten intoxicated with the use of economic coercion is that on the one hand, yes, they believe that military force has not been a particularly productive way to go, but there's still behind them a belief that our military edge is so overwhelming that nobody is going to, sock us in the jaw because, they couldn't possibly dream of doing such a thing. And I think particularly when you're looking at a country like China or even Russia under certain circumstances, that's a very, very dangerous assumption to make. I mean, we may, these things do not, as you pointed out, exist in completely separate silos. They do interact with each other. And, that I think is an additional danger in all this.
Yeah, I want to heartily second my partner in crime here's observation. I think it was Dean Acheson who said you can't put military and economic power in the functional equivalent of a cream separator. And I'm going to ask you kind of a two-part question, Eddie, and I apologize in advance because I think it's going to be a long-winded question. So bear with me. It's sparked in part by the experience that Eliot and I had working with Stuart Levy, the Undersecretary for Terrorist Finance, who plays quite a large role in your book throughout, and who we worked with very closely on both North Korea and Iran sanctions in Bush 43. If I had a bone to pick with your book, I would say that I think you're a little bit dismissive of that episode from 06 to 08. I don't think it was just Stuart trying to prove that George Bush was wrong when he said we had sanctioned Iran to the point where we had no influence. I mean, Eliot and I, in one instance, gave Stewart a ride on the G5 I had in the Department of Defense as undersecretary to go to Europe to scare the hell out of European banks, as he did so well, about having to, doing business with Iran. And we did get 2 UN Security Council resolutions condemning Iran during Bush 43. But I guess my concern is, and so the larger question I have is, undoubtedly, this tool gives you leverage of sorts. And there's no question that it brought North Korea to the negotiating table in the 6-party talks in Bush 43, and Iran to the table in the Obama administration. That being said, it's not the be all and end all. It's not a silver bullet, as Eliot was saying, although I think sometimes policymakers think of it that way. And a lot of it depends on, how you use it. So kind of one question is, do we tend to take our foot off our adversaries' necks, if you will, too soon? Because I would argue, and I think Eliot would agree, that in the case of North Korea, for instance, Stewart, slapped on those, he and Juan Zarate slapped on those Banco Delta Asia sanctions. And then, Condi Rice persuaded Hank Paulson to pull them off because Chris Hill, the negotiator, was saying, these guys won't do any more negotiating unless we take these off because they're squealing too much. Now, my own instinct at the time was, sanction them more because now you know that you've got them, sort of on the run. But our tendency is actually to relieve the sanctions sort of prematurely. And that there is another side to that, which you explore in the case of Iran, which is sometimes you put the sanctions on and you actually can't even really get them off when you're trying to, because you've overfulfilled the plan, as I might have said in an earlier part of my career, because you've scared the banks so much that they won't go back in, to do business in Iran. So one is, do we, take these things, off too soon? And then the other is, what's your assessment ultimately of the record here? I mean, putting aside the rightness and wrongness of Trump having withdrawn from, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, had he not done that, we would still be approaching the expiration of the ballistic missile ban in the UN in October. We would still be approaching, the end of snapback. And, Iran would still have all of these advanced centrifuges that it's been testing, et cetera. They might not have enriched uranium at the same level, but even President Obama said at the end of this deal, they will be days away from having, sufficient fissile material to have a nuclear weapon. In the case of Russia, sanctions didn't really force them to change course in the war in 2014 or 15. It didn't prevent them. The prospect of, you make the point that they didn't anticipate sanctions in 2014 and 15 when they were taking Crimea and destabilizing eastern Ukraine. But the promise of sanctions in 21 and early 22 obviously didn't dissuade Putin from going in. So it wasn't much of a deterrent. You could argue it's, hampered their war effort, but it hadn't stopped it. And maybe we'll get negotiations soon. I'm kind of color me skeptical, but and in China, it seems to me that our efforts there are just, that's, TBD. We don't know whether that's going to be successful or not. So I'd appreciate, kind of your answer to, do we pull these things off too soon? And what's the real record here of accomplishment?
Yeah, great questions, and there's lots to unpack. So I'll answer a bit of it, but I'll also pause at some point so we can see if there's more you want to double click on. On your first point about do we sort of take our foot off the gas when it comes to sanctions, I don't think that that's necessarily like a pathology of U.S. policy, but I'll examine the two cases you mentioned, which are North Korea and Iran. I think with respect to North Korea in the second Bush term, so 2005 to 2009, almost certainly we took off the pressure too soon. And if you even go back and look at that era, just to maybe level set with listeners, the Banco Delta Asia 311 action happens in 2005. It's almost a shock in terms of how impactful it is. It's a regulatory action against a small bank in Macau that leads to a broad, basically severing of North Korea's financial relationships with banks across the region. And I do think that in retrospect, the State Department kind of rolled the Treasury Department. And the State Department wanted to kind of push the diplomatic front, even though Treasury at the time was really saying, look, there's much more we can do to get more leverage.
And we were Stewart's biggest supporters in DOD. I mean, we did not want to take those things off either.
Sure. I haven't talked to Stewart about that specifically, but I trust you on that. But look, I think that that experience also is emblematic of the time, where at the time, Stewart Levy was just a couple years into his job as the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. That was a whole new part of the Treasury Department. And these guys were still basically upstarts, right? And to try to do a bureaucratic battle against Condoleezza Rice's State Department was a losing proposition for Treasury at that time. I think over sort of the sweep of my narrative in Chokepoints, Treasury winds up getting more clout. And in fact, sometimes now, winds up playing a slightly different role, which is something we can talk about. With respect to Iran, I mean, it's a more complicated picture, right? Because the North Korea pressure was really built over that one action. With Iran, Stewart Levy starts his financial isolation campaign against Iran in 2006. And we don't get the first Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that freezes Iran's program until November of 2013. So it's literally a 7-year journey. Stewart, as many people know, was reappointed by President Obama and serves the first 2 years of the Obama administration. So it's something almost an endangered species in Washington, a bipartisan, policy leader. So that's a much longer campaign with many more twists and turns. I can speak to that one with direct experience because I was actually part of the team that was implementing the Iran sanctions in the lead up to the nuclear deal. And my job, in retrospect, was really at the kind of the tip of the spear because I had the responsibility for the Asia portfolio. So I was the guy who went to places like Singapore to talk to shipping companies and oil refiners and say, if you're doing business with Iran, you're threat. We could cut you off from the U.S. financial system. Implementing secondary sanctions against China and Japan. And that was really where the rubber met the road because, at the time, really Iran's lifeline was selling oil to Asia. And I think my belief at the time, which was one that was shared with, Adam Zubin and David Cohen, who were Stewart's successors at Treasury, as well as the people like Richard Nephew, who I was working with this at State, wasn't so much that, it wouldn't be a good thing if we had more pressure on Iran. It was that we really had gotten to the end of our road in terms of how much pressure we could reasonably build. At that time, Iran was fully cut off from everything involved with the US. So it was really just about secondary sanctions. It was really how much could we get the Chinese to actually stop buying Iranian oil? We succeeded. I mean, we got the Chinese to cut their Iranian oil purchases by almost half, right? But the idea that we could get them to zero, I think, was something that I never saw evidence of in all my time working at the State Department. This was an interesting interplay because also, Congress had this role where they were really forcing the Obama administration to do tougher and tougher sanctions, right? But Congress, just signing a bill into law doesn't do very much. We saw that with CATSA, right? I mean, Congress tried to do this to Trump in 2017, but you didn't have a willing party in the Trump administration to implement it. And so it didn't work, right? You didn't actually succeed in cutting off Russia's military sales to places like Turkey, which I'm sure is something, Eric, you could weigh in on. But, with respect to the Iran secondary oil sanctions, which were a congressional, originated actually in the National Defense Authorization Act at the end of 2011 for fiscal year 2012. I mean, the Obama administration was a willing partner, right? We went around and we gave it a good college try, and we succeeded in cutting Iran's oil sales from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day. So my own view is, we didn't have very much more we could actually reasonably do to increase economic pressure on Iran in 2013, 2014, 2015. I think, if anything, probably the base case scenario was if we refused to negotiate with Rouhani and Zarif, that the pressure would dissipate or at the very least plateau. And so I do think we were at the right time to try to cut a deal. I don't think we've removed pressure too soon. Whether or not, John Kerry and the technical team could have negotiated better terms to the deal, I would defer to arms control experts like yourself on that. But I think from a sanctions perspective, I think that we were either at the point of maximum leverage, or it was so uncertain that it was probably the right time to do the diplomacy.
Let me draw you out a little bit on that, and Eliot, I think, wants to come in too. So, look, if you kind of carry the story forward a bit, the Trump administration, of course, pulls out of the deal. Now, you can argue that, a variety of ways. But one thing that does happen under Trump, and you kind of advert to this in the book, is he launches this, maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which a lot of sanctions experts say is not going to work because it's unilateral and the, allies aren't bored. But it actually does put an enormous pressure on, the Iranian economy, to the point where you're getting, massive public protests in 17, 18, and into 19 about the economic consequences of this. I mean, as you point out, there was no off-ramp for the Iranians to take, and I take that point. But on the other hand, when the Obama group comes in, they stop enforcing the sanctions, although they promise they're going to get a longer, better deal. And of course, they spend 2 years kind of spinning their wheels with the Iranians and get absolutely nowhere.
Sure. Yeah. Real quick on that. And I assume you meant Biden when he came in.
I meant Biden.
Yeah. I thought that's what you meant. So a few things on that. I do think that from like an analytical perspective, and like the maximum pressure experience is really interesting, because I think what it does is it gives a lie to the idea that you need a multilateral coalition to impose severe economic pressure. And this is really, is why I make such a big deal out of these choke points, right? Because not only do you not have our allies supporting us in 2018 and 2019, they're actively going against us, right? The Brits, the French, and the Germans literally tried to build a platform to facilitate financial transactions with Iran and bypassing the dollar-based system. It's called Instex, and it completely fails because all the European banks are worried about secondary sanctions. So I think you're right, Eric, that the U.S. has tremendous unilateral power when it comes to sanctions. The thing I would take some issue with is, if you look at just the magnitude of the economic recession that maximum pressure caused, it's about a third as bad as the 2013 recession Iran had. So Iran's economy did not suffer nearly as bad as it did in the lead up to Rouhani's election. I would also say that the context was quite different in that, in 2013, that recession, which was significantly worse, was happening at a time when you had an extremist hardliner as president of Iran, and his policy was basically being discredited by this economic recession. The context, of course, in 2018, 2019 is you had an administration in place in Iran that had taken the presidency with the idea that they were going to negotiate on the nuclear program. And so what you really did was you discredited the negotiations, which I think is why you got someone like Raisi in 2021. The other thing, too, to note on maximum pressure is that, not only was the magnitude of the economic crisis smaller than the one in 2013, it was also short-lived, right? By the time Biden comes in, Iran's economy is already rebounded, right? And I think that's natural. That's not necessarily like to say that this was a bad sanctions regime or something. This is just how sanctions work. It's very hard, absent like being a war-torn country like Syria. It's hard for sanctions to actually cause like a recession that lasts for years and years and years and years, right? Targets adapt, right? They develop their own workarounds. They go on, right? Iran's a big country. It's got 80 million people, right? They figure out how to live under the conditions of sanctions. And so I think the challenge, if you're using sanctions as diplomatic leverage, is knowing when to try to trade those chips in. Maybe had Trump made a more earnest effort in 2019 to get back into the deal or to extend some of the timelines, maybe he could have succeeded. And I know there are former Trump administration officials who say that they were close to one at different points. But I think now we're in a very tough spot with respect to sanctions on Iran because we've sort of exhausted them to a certain extent. I think to the extent we do have leverage over Iran right now, a lot of it is because the Israelis have wiped out their air defenses and gotten rid of their deterrent in Lebanon, which I think does give us leverage. But yeah, I think that maximum pressure, in retrospect, was one of the worst policy decisions we've seen in the 21st century of American foreign policy because we didn't really gain anything, and as we all know, Iran has a breakout, basically a threshold nuclear capability right now.
So color me deeply skeptical in a way about the whole enterprise in the following sense. Do I think economic leverage of any kind would induce North Korea to give up its nuclear program? No, I don't. I mean, because you have a leadership which doesn't really care that much about the economic welfare of its people, and it has, in its own mind, excellent reasons for wanting to have nuclear weapons. I would say ditto Iran, where it's not Rouhani or anybody like that who's making the decisions. It's the supreme leader. And the supreme leader wants nuclear weapons. And I understand why he wants nuclear weapons. It makes perfect sense. And he's willing to engage in a lot of suffering. And as you point out, countries adjust to it. Do I think economic sanctions could have stopped or reversed the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022? No. I mean, I just think Putin thought this was important enough. It's his vision of Russia and of himself and so on. So, I mean, I guess and I think other cases where people have really tried to bring a country to heel with sanctions, even, like a tiny postage stamp like Rhodesia, the way sanctions work, I think were kind of long-term in terms of weakening an economy and a society. And that makes perfect sense to me. So, I mean, I'd be in favor of, maximum sanctions on the Iranians and on the Russians today, and I suppose North Korea too, as a way of weakening those systems in the long haul, but with very little notion that it's going to bring you a deal. And I think in a way that's the sort of misconception of the Obama policy too. You weren't going to get a real nuclear deal from the Iranians. You might get a temporary thing where, of course, they would continue to cheat. Ditto North Korea. I mean, Eric and I had long conversations about my State Department colleague, Chris Hill, who convinced himself that no nuclear deal was possible. And of course, they had a parallel program going on, which was subsequently uncovered and publicized. So I just don't, I think it's a mistake to think that, you tighten the economic thumb screws and you get the deal you want. Not on something of first order importance and not with a hard authoritarian regime that really doesn't matter if, the average Joe Blow is suffering as a result. So is that too dark of you?
It's a little dark, but I don't think it's necessarily wrong, right? And I think one thing that we should all appreciate is that tools of economic warfare are limited tools, right? And so if you're using a limited tool, you should expect to get limited success and pursue limited objectives. And something I've talked about in various forums, including testimony, is like, if your goal of sanctions is behavior change, right? Deterrence, compellence. I mean, those are really difficult things to achieve, even with the use of military statecraft, right? And so I think that you got to be, you have to have your expectations under control. That's why I think, when we think about the use of sanctions as a tool of attrition, which is something I've also written about, they're oftentimes more, not necessarily more successful, but you're at least less likely to be disappointed, right? And I think after the Russian large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, when deterrence clearly failed, and we can talk about that because I think it's a really interesting historical case study, we did pivot to really an attrition strategy and really viewing the sanctions and export controls as the flip side of the military assistance to Ukrainians. Whereas on the one hand, we're strengthening the Ukrainians' capacity economically and militarily, and on the other hand, we're weakening Russia's capacity. And I think, for that, it's very hard to prove how successful they are because you don't know the counterfactual. But the thing I will say is when I first started working on Russia sanctions in 2014, Russian companies had $700 billion worth of dollar-denominated debt obligations. So basically, U.S. banks were funding the Russian economy, right? ExxonMobil was developing the entire Russian oil sector, right? I mean, Rex Tillerson literally became CEO of ExxonMobil because of his success with partnerships with, Rosneft in Russia, right? So, I mean, would Russia's economy be much stronger today if they still had access to U.S. capital markets and technology? I mean, almost certainly, right? I mean, so I think that the Russia sanctions have been disappointing in that they failed as a deterrent. Eliot, your argument seems to be that we could have never deterred Putin. I think there's no way of really knowing whether we could have deterred him through economic means. But the one thing I will say is it's very clear, and I don't think we need to read Putin's mind on this, that the Russians underestimated how bad the economic harm on Russia would be. And I think that the reason they underestimated it was because starting in the Obama administration, exacerbated during the Trump administration, we had given Russia repeatedly a free pass for various misdeeds that they did. And so I think Putin looked back at the 2014-2015 sanctions, which, by the way, sent Russia's economy into a tailspin. In the winter of 2014-2015, their economy was contracting at an annualized rate of 10%. So it's actually a higher magnitude even than the Iranian economic crisis in 2013 or 2019. And instead of forcing our advantage, instead of pressing our advantage in early 2015, we gave Merkel and Hollande, the green light to go do the Minsk deal, which, by the way, was being violated as it was being signed, right? The Russians took another big Ukrainian town of Debaltseve days after Minsk 2 was signed. And then, of course, months later, Putin signs the Nord Stream 2, pipeline deal with the Germans. So I think that the lesson that Russia takes from that experience is that, wow, the West really does have the ability to capsize my economy if they want to, but they don't have the will to do so. These democracies in the West, they won't even take a 10-cent increase in gasoline prices, to help Ukraine. And by the way, I think, in some ways he was right, but in other ways he was wrong.
So you raised some questions at the end of the book, Eddie, about things that the Trump administration has done that have called in overreach by the U.S. on sanctions that we've done, but also now the Trump administration has been sanctioning our allies and calling into question the reserve currency status of the dollar, around which so much of this revolves. But you also say, so the age of economic warfare may be coming to a close, and we may regret that. So can you comment a little bit on that?
Sure. So, I do think that for the first time really in my own adult life, I do think the dollar is in a very precarious position. And it's really driven by the fact that Trump has done everything that he possibly could to undermine confidence in the dollar. First, economic warfare against everyone, right? It's one thing, when you're fighting an economic war against China and Russia, of course, China and Russia are going to find a way to hedge against their reliance on the dollar. And in fact, in 2018, after the Trump administration was pressured by Congress to impose sanctions on Rusal, the Russian central bank dumped all of its dollars and reallocated toward euros, which is why in the debate over seizing Russian sovereign assets, it's really a question about whether Europe is going to do it, because most of those assets are sitting in Europe. But when you're doing this against everybody, everyone has an incentive to hedge, right? It's not just China and Russia. It's, Brazil, it's India, it's Vietnam, it's, Australia, and every country was hit with some of these tariffs. And so I think that's the reason why you've seen the dollar depreciate in value relative to pretty much every other major currency. But when you add to that the fact that Trump has called into question the independence of the Federal Reserve, right? Repeatedly threatening to fire Jay Powell. And of course, there's concerns about who he will nominate, even if as his successor, even if Powell does serve out his term until, May of next year. And then, calling into question the sort of basic elements of the rule of law with, deporting American citizens to foreign countries. These are the types of things that make foreign investors and central bank managers concerned about the dollar as a safe haven, right? That has been the key to the dollar, that it is a safe haven. That's a place where you're always going to get your money back. I think Trump is weakening this at the same time that other competitors to the dollar, there's actually a bullish case to be made for them. I think the first place to look is Europe. right? The euro has always been sort of this like second place reserve currency, 20% of global foreign exchange reserves versus 60%. I mean, if the Europeans are serious about rearmament and joint debt issuance, which I think we'll know more of when Merz finally takes over as chancellor next month, I do think you'll start seeing the euro chip away at the dollar's role. That doesn't mean that we're going to wake up and the euro is going to be the world's reserve currency, but it does mean that there will be an alternative, right? And you can't just assume that the dollar is necessary for every cross-border transaction, or that, there's limitless demand for US treasuries. And I think that we underestimate how dramatically that would change our foreign policy and really the way we run our government, because all of a sudden we'd have to potentially raise taxes quite a bit, or cut federal expenditures. From the perspective of missing the age of economic warfare when it's gone, I mean, I'm of the belief, and maybe this is a bleak view, that geopolitical competition for almost all of human history has been a fact of life. There have only been these very few, very small periods like the 1990s where we actually thought that we had sort of consigned geopolitical competition to the dustbin of history. And so if we're going to have intensifying geopolitical competition, and if all of a sudden we have something that looks more like autarky, where we really can't compete effectively through economic warfare, I do worry that will lead to more shooting wars, that there's going to need to be an outlet for some of this tension between great powers. And if sanctions, export controls no longer have teeth, and frankly, if we no longer feel like we can acquire resources, as I mentioned earlier, through trade, that there's going to be more military warfare. And that's something I really worry about, because, probably the biggest accomplishment of American statecraft of the 20th century was to really move past what had been, these wars that, our parents and grandparents had to live through.
Well, that's a suitably bleak note on which to end this episode of Shield of the Republic. Our guest has been Eddie Fishman, the author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. I don't think economic warfare is going to go away that quickly, Eddie. So hopefully we can have you back, because you're a frequent contributor to Foreign Affairs, Atlantic, New York Times, and other outlets. So I'm sure you'll be writing more about various subjects in which we're interested. But thanks for spending this time with us today on Shield of the Republic.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for the rich discussion.